Well, hello, my name is John Meyer, and I love drums. Most of the time, the louder, the better. But there are times when I want that traditional drum kit vibe to go along with the softer, quieter music that I'm making. I don't always want to reach for shakers or cajones or other light percussion instruments. I want the sound of drums being hit, just quieter. So this video is about making soft drum samples. My friend Joel Cameron was in the studio recently playing drums on a session, and so I had him stick around an extra day for some sampling fun, and I'll let him tell you about the kit that he brought.
This is a 1968. That was a very good year. 68, that's how old I am. Anyway, 2012-16 drum kit in psychedelic red. 20-inch bass drum, but I don't think I've ever recorded it that it didn't sound like a 24. They're just good, tunable, flexible drums. And they're small. You can fit them in your van without too much trouble.
When I mic up drums, I use pretty much every mic I have in my microphone closet. This time Joel brought some mics along like he usually does to experiment with, including this tape recorder. Really cool vibe. Didn't end up using it. It's a little noisy for these soft drum samples, but still very cool. On the kick, we use two mics. On the inside, a Beta 52 pointing towards the beater to get the attack of the drum. And on the outside, we use this rather cheap Recording Tools large diaphragm mic. It sounded pretty good. The snare we used was a 1960s Ludwig Acrolite with an SM57 on top. Underneath the snare, we used another one of Joel's mics that he brought over that I know nothing about. Again, sounded pretty good. We used my KM84 on the hi-hats. On the toms, I usually use my Sennheiser 441s, but in this instance, Joel talked me into using these AKG D200 condenser mics in order to capture more detail from the quieter sounding toms. For room mics, I used a pair of Coles 4038s out in front of the kit. Years ago, I watched a video by the producer Greg Wells and his engineer Ian MacGregor, and they walked through their process of miking up drums. Now, it's common to put the room mics out in front of the kit, directly in front of the kick drum, or spaced out in the room. When you do that, you can run into some issues with getting the kick and the snare in the center of your image. So if you move it over to the side and draw an imaginary line that starts at the snare and works its way through the kick drum out to the front of the kick, if you put your room mics in that spot, then your kick and snare are guaranteed to be in the center of the image. To position the overheads, we used a similar technique. I'm using my pair of U47 clones that were actually built by Joel, and I'll let Joel explain how we go about positioning those mics.
I'm holding a cable here. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to make sure the overhead mics are, for the most part, the same distance from the snare drum. The snare drum is never in the middle of the kit. Think of the bass drum as the center of the kit. The snare drum, in this case, is off to that, because if it's off a foot or so on each side, the kit, snare's gonna be closer to it than the one on the right side of the kit, and I don't want that, because if it's off a foot or so on each side, that's, it creates a slight delay in the sound getting from one to another. It sounds insignificant, and sometimes it can be, but sometimes it can be pretty surprising how much it'll make the center image of the snare drum indistinct from the overheads, and I don't want that. I want a very solid image. So basically, I just take a cable, put the end of the cable in the middle of the snare drum, and then stretch it out, if this will let me, to the front of the microphone. And then I'll swing it over to the next one, make sure that one's actually about an inch high. So I'm gonna bring it down just a little bit. So that's pretty close right there. And then the other thing is I've angled these mics such that they're more or less pointing toward the snare. The off-axis coloration is going to be real similar. They're both pointing toward the side of the snare drum. It's the same kind of thing too, in that if one was pointed away from the snare drum, there's off-axis coloration. The further off-axis a sound is, the more it just changes the frequency response. So the snare would have a different timbre in one ear than it would in the other. So having them basically looking at the snare the same way at the same distance gives a good solid center image, because snare is usually straight up the middle of the mix, as is the kick drum. So this is usually a really good way with the overheads, get a lot of snare drum, and are a big part of most drum sounds in a mix. That's just a good way to keep everything solid.
For the cymbals, we used a set of Zildjian K Customs. I know there is no shortage of drum sounds available online, and so I wanted to do something a little bit different. I love the sound of muted, padded down drums, so we took it a step further by laying blankets on the drums and then hitting them with these ProMark broomsticks. You get the sound of brushes, but you still get the tone of the drum. For the kick, we put a fluffy Vic Firth beater on so that the attack would be softened just a bit. For preamps, I used a pair of Rascal Audio 2Rs. Rascal Audio is Joel Cameron. He designed and built the pre's. And also I have another 8 channels of DIY preamps that are made to sound like APIs. We recorded multiple takes of each drum so that I could build round robins and have plenty of options. Now, I didn't get as many as I planned on, but I got enough to make it work. I then spent a ridiculous amount of time chopping up the samples, mapping them to the appropriate keys in Kontakt, and I really still don't know what I'm doing. But I'm getting better, and I think there's an instrument here that sounds pretty good. Before I chopped up the samples, I mixed them in a natural way, not a ton of compression, not a ton of EQ, so that you have some options in your mix. Like I said earlier, I'm not a Kontakt editor. There are flaws in these sounds, but there are ways around it. So for my process, I keep everything on one track while I'm composing. So all my drums on one instrument track in Pro Tools. Then when I'm ready to commit, which I always do for lots of reasons. One, it's just good to commit and move on. And also, I want to make sure that if I have to revisit this whatever session I'm working on in 5 years, if I don't have that particular instrument or plugin, I'm in bad shape. So before I print audio, I duplicate that instrument track as many times as necessary. So say I just played kick, snare, and hat, I'll duplicate it twice, get rid of everything but the kick on the first one, everything but the snare on the second, and everything but the hat on the third. Then I'll commit those. And if there are some weird sample hits throughout the piece, I might go and just manually edit the audio to find, take one good hit from one section and move it to the other. And that's how I polish and clean up my tracks. Then I can mix them down similar to the way I mixed them in the first place. It's not exactly the same because the mics are not separated out, but you still have quite a bit more control. You can bring the kick up, the snare, you can add more reverb to the snare and not the kick. You have options that way. I know that many of you found your way over here from Christian Henson's videos or Piano Book, and I just want to say welcome and thank you. Recently, Christian put me on his Piano Book honors list for some samples that I made. I thought that was really cool. Back in college when I was a freshman, I got a letter from Texas A&M saying, if you have another semester of 1.5 GPA, you won't be allowed to come back. So never did I think I'd make an honors list of any kind. So super cool. I love making samples. I hope that you enjoy using them, and I hope that when you go to use these soft drum samples, you think of this little studio in Carrollton, Texas, and you can kind of put a face to the sounds. And so I want to keep making these videos. It would really help if you subscribed and liked, tell your friends, do all that, and I'll be back with more videos very soon.